Okay, so now I should be able to hit screen share, share the desktop. Okay, and now I should just start your class. Let's see, I don't usually do this on,
There it is.
on Macs. I guess it's working.
So does that mean it's working?
I think so.
Okay, yeah.
So it should be recorded.
Okay, excellent. Well then, come on in, everybody. Well, wherever you can see where I won't be blocking your view.
With the space recursively fading into the distance.
Yeah, please sit up close, because there's not going to be that many of us, and I'll feel silly talking to the back of the room.
When people come to my public hearings and they all sit in the back, I'm like, it's just like church, you'll get more out of it. Yes, everybody comes up.
You call on first.
No, they have to say they want to make public comments.
So there's an occasional church service where somebody calls somebody.
That's true. In law school, it was, law professors have to call on their students. And one guy, our first semester, he hadn't done the homework, of course, and he said, "I'll pass." And the professor, "You're not going to." And the professor said, "Yeah, I don't think so."
Nice chill things.
And one of my professors has a deck of cards in his pocket. That's Professor Kidwell. And he said he had a system whereby, depending on which card he pulled out of his pocket, he knew who to call on. I think it was right.
Okay. Well, all of this is being broadcasted.
Oh, it is.
There's probably not that many people watching this live. I'll turn the beginning one second.
We can cut out those.
Okay.
Anyway, well, since it's 6:30, we'll just go ahead and start, and if anyone else joins us, that will be great. Well, actually, there's a couple of people coming. Maybe I should give them 2 more minutes. It's 6:29. Okay. Well, let's wait 1 more minute, because I see a couple of people that just walked in, and they wouldn't want to miss the thrilling introduction. You guys have to sit sort of close up to the front, so I don't feel like I'm just talking way to the back. Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming. I think that I know all of you, but I'm Anne Marsh, and this is part 2 of Unitarian Universalist history. Last time we talked about our 2 traditions, Unitarianism and Universalism, from their earliest days, back at the very beginnings of Christianity, up to about 1900. So tonight we will move on to the 20th century. But first, recall that we began in the earliest days of Christianity with the Unitarian idea that God is one rather than a trinity, and the Universalist idea that all will be saved. And today we might say all life is one, and all are worthy, or all have inherent worth. By the 20th century, which we're about to start talking about, we had expanded those foundational beliefs to a set of values that we still hold. Throughout the 20th century, we didn't so much change our values as we did try to work on what it means to actually live them and act on them. For example, in 1900, we had not yet acknowledged that the value all have inherent worth means full equality across lines of color, gender, class, and sexual orientation. Today, we're still a work in progress. So at the dawn of the 20th century, Unitarians and Universalists were still 60 years away from merging. but both denominations were greatly influenced by a movement in Protestantism called the social gospel. The social gospel declared that it was humanity's task to create the kingdom of God here on earth right now, and that Christian ideals must be realized in the social and economic relationships between people. The movement was spurred by class struggles and labor unrest, and by a growing awareness of how unbridled capitalism had widened the gap between rich and poor. This may sound familiar. Given the history of Unitarian and Universalist involvement in the reform movements of the 19th century that we talked about last time, it's not surprising to find some of our forebears front and center in this movement to redistribute wealth and end poverty. One of them was Francis Peabody, a Unitarian minister and professor of social ethics at Harvard. In his 1900 book, Jesus Christ and the Social Question, Peabody argued that moral issues are often political and vice versa. A church that stays within its own walls, he said, is not worth much. Religion must move out into the public sphere and respond to the imperative to create a social order of justice, equity, and compassion for all. The social gospel opposes today's prosperity gospel and remains a strong part of who we are. Clarence Skinner was a social gospel universalist, and he led an effort to translate religious values into action in the political and economic sphere, devoted much of his life to fostering within universalism not just a social conscience, but social engagement. For him, the old universalist idea that all will find salvation means all are bound together. We are responsible for each other and for building a better world for all people. Skinner had a long career at Crane Theological Seminary, but he was never an ivory tower academic. He founded Community Church in Boston, which was a non-denominational church, no denominational boundaries, and there he pioneered the idea of having open discussions on political and social issues and maintained an active social justice committee. Now, those programs are commonplace today, but in his time, very unusual. He also criticized the individualism of many religious liberals, saying that a concern for the community of humanity was just as important, if not more so, than concern for an individual's freedom. Like Skinner, Unitarian minister John Haynes Holmes believed that the church must be an agent of social change. Holmes was a humanist, but theology mattered less to him than engagement in social issues. Our values must be embodied in action, so religion must roll up its sleeves and get to work. Holmes practiced what he preached. He was an active member of the American Civil Liberties Union and founding member of the NAACP. And from the pulpit, he urged a radical redistribution of wealth. An outspoken pacifist during both world wars, he espoused nonviolent resistance and helped make Gandhi's work known in the US. During World War I, the American Unitarian Association, in a clear violation of its principle of freedom of conscience, announced that it would withhold support from any church whose minister did not wholeheartedly support our government's war efforts. This included Holmes, who was denounced from the floor of the 1917 Unitarian Conference, which was the forerunner to our General Assembly. He was denounced by moderator and former US President William Howard Taft. Holmes had proposed a resolution in favor of peace. Taft's opposing pro-war resolution passed almost unanimously. After the war, the American Unitarian Association apologized for going against its own values. And during World War II, pacifists were able to speak out freely. But Holmes had already taken his own path. In 1919, he led his New York congregation away from the denominational fold, to become this non-sectarian community church of New York, focusing on work for social justice. His legacy lingers in the community church of today, which is now a diverse religious community that is part of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Both Skinner and Holmes were humanists, and indeed by the second decade of the 20th century, there was a growing trend in liberal religion toward humanism, which sees religion as a human enterprise rather than a divine one. The idea of God as a supernatural being, the creator and controller of the universe, began to be replaced by the idea that God, if we choose to use that name at all, is instead a symbol for love or goodness or our highest aspirations. In 1933, a number of Unitarian ministers and one Universalist signed the Humanist Manifesto, a public statement of humanist beliefs. Some of the manifesto's 15 points include: the universe is self-existing, not created. Humanity has evolved through nature's processes. Religious ideas must be formulated in light of science. Theism's time is past. And human fulfillment is in the here and now, where we must live in a shared world. Two later humanist manifestos have had an increased focus on human rights. Like the social gospel, humanism continues to be a strong thread in today's Unitarian Universalism. For some, however, mid-20th century humanism lacked sustenance for the spirit. Critics said that humanist services were fiddle and lecture shows, a talk, never a sermon, with a little music. These critics were not traditional theists, but they sensed something greater than self for which God could be a symbol. So began a humanist-theist tension that has been at times divisive for us and at other times creative. One who saw that tension as creative was Frederick May Elliott, elected president of the American Unitarian Association in 1937. He combined the ability to get things done with the ability to inspire people, and his vision and skills were just what was needed, for Elliott's was a big tent Unitarianism. He said, one of the most interesting aspects of our history is the process by which the radicals of one generation have come to be regarded as 100% regular Unitarians by succeeding generations. We are a church in which growth is not only permitted, but encouraged. During his 21 years as AUA president, no term limits back then, Elliott began many programs that still thrive: religious education, the service committee, fellowships, all of which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. He also wanted to merge with the Universalists, with whom he hoped to form a new denomination called the Liberal Church of America. If he had succeeded, our name would be less of a mouthful than it is. But steps toward the goal were taken, but Elliott did not live to see merger, which happened 3 years after his death. While Elliott was reorganizing the American Unitarian Association, Robert Cummins was hoping to do much the same for the Universalist Church of America. Cummins was also dynamic and tireless with strong organizational skills and served as head of the UCA for 15 years. Up to this point, fiercely independent Universalist congregations had resisted any kind of central organization. Cummins established a head office in Boston in a building donated by the Unitarians and embarked on an ambitious program to centralize resources. When he left office, denominational structures were finally in place, but sadly, there were even fewer Universalist churches than when he began. Cummins had stressed a new universalism, focused not on the divinity of Jesus, but on living his teachings by working to rid the world of bloodshed, suffering, and sorrow, as he put it. And more than that, he said, universalism should not be bound by the limits of any one religion. The question for the next decade was, would universalism remain a Christian denomination, or would it seek to become a truly universal religion? Kenneth Patton's answer was the latter, a universal religion. Ken Patton was an iconoclastic minister and prolific poet who served both Universalist and Unitarian churches and revitalized our worship. In 1949, he became minister of the Charles Street Meeting House in Boston, an experiment created by the Massachusetts Universalist Convention. They wanted to redefine universalism toward a new goal of bringing all religions together into a religion for one world. At Charles Street, Patton used symbolism from all the world's religions, which was an idea revolutionary in his time. You can see the world religion symbols up against the back and also painted onto the balconies. He, in addition to the world religions symbols, he had a circular sanctuary with the map of the earth on the floor, and a mural of the great nebula in Andromeda. The bookcase that you can see at the back is full of the scriptures from all the world's religions. And he also had a sculpture of an atom, which doesn't show in this picture, and art and artifacts from all around the world. Our forebears had been using the 1936 hymnal called Hymns of the Spirit, which had Protestant tunes and Bible readings. But Patton created new hymns and found readings from all the world's religions. Many of his texts are included in the 1964 Hymns for the Celebration of Life, the blue hymnal. Soon after he left Boston, the Charles Street Meeting House closed its doors, unfortunately. But Patton had already opened up our worship, and it's been said that he taught a stumble-footed humanism how to dance. For the philosophers among us, let me just very briefly mention 3 Unitarian Universalist names. 2 were innovative philosopher theologians Charles Hartshorne and Henry Nelson Wyman. They were both exponents of what's called process theology, wherein God is a participant along with the rest of life in cosmic evolution, working in relationship as beings interact. There is no preordained divine plan. The universe is always becoming, and we are co-creators with God. Minister, social activist, and theologian James Luther Adams taught social ethics at Harvard and the University of Chicago and wrote, "We deny the immaculate conception of virtue and affirm the necessity of social incarnation. The holy thing in life is participation in the processes that give body and form to universal justice." The Spirit, for Adams, works in community, connecting us to something beyond ourselves. Well, as we explored these theological issues, we also looked outward. In 1933 and 36, Unitarians had passed resolutions condemning Hitler's treatment of the Jews and the suffering of European refugees. In 1939, after Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, Unitarian minister Waitstill Sharp and his wife Martha went to Prague, where they assisted refugees and set up escape routes for Jews and anti-Nazis. A year later, the Sharps were in France, organizing a project to help children escape to safety. If you haven't seen the recent Ken Burns documentary about the Sharps, you can borrow it from our church library. The Unitarian Service Committee was organized in 1940 to support these efforts and other humanitarian projects in war-torn Europe. Meanwhile, the Universalists likewise set up a war relief committee in 1940 to organize work in Europe, especially in the Netherlands and Hungary. The group was renamed the Universalist Service Committee in 1945, and that same year, the Unitarian and Universalist Service Committees, still two separate units, began to discuss doing some joint projects. And they did join forces after the war on several programs, particularly one for displaced children in Germany. Today, through a network of grassroots organizations and staff and volunteers, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee works at home and abroad to fight poverty, bring disaster relief, and promote human rights and environmental justice. Our time is limited tonight. Even though I only have 100 years to cover, I still can't really fit everything into an hour. So I'm focusing on UU history in the United States, but I just have to make an exception for this guy, Norbert Čapek. He was a Unitarian minister in Prague before and during World War II. Čapek created flower communion in 1923 as part of his search for meaningful rituals for religious liberals. His wife Maya brought it to this country, where it continues in many UU churches, including ours. Bringing a flower and taking home a different one symbolizes that we are individuals in community, enriched by our diversity and embraced by a transcendent unity. Čapek's Unitarian Church in Prague was a center for the resistance movement during World War II, when the Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia. Čapek helped many escape, but he himself was eventually arrested and sent to the concentration camp at Dachau, prisoner number 30323. He was killed by the Nazis in 1942. But others who survived that camp said it was Čapek who kept their hopes alive. He was a man who said yes to life, even in the darkest days, and he can inspire us all. Thomas Jefferson wrote that since there was no Unitarian church in his hometown of Charlottesville, Virginia, he must be content to be an Unitarian by myself. 130 years later, in 1944, the Church of the Larger Fellowship was founded to reach out to the Jeffersons of this world, Unitarians and later Unitarian Universalists who did not live near a UU congregation. Today, there are thousands of CLF members around the world. The program offers prison outreach, online worship services and discussions, the Quest newsletter with sermons and meditations. The Church of the Larger Fellowship was helping to spread the message of liberal religion to the hinterlands, but whenever possible, the American Unitarian Association wanted to bring individuals together to form congregations. Not enough ministers were available. So in 1948, we began establishing lay-led fellowships wherever small groups of Unitarians could be gathered. A layperson, Monroe Husband, headed up this program. Through his efforts, the American Unitarian Association provided organizational ideas, worship materials, and religious education curricula, and then each fellowship became responsible for its own leadership and direction. This do-it-yourself movement sparked the founding of more than 400 new groups in the 1950s, including the Unitarian Fellowship of Los Alamos, which was founded in 1953. By 1958, fellowships had attracted 10,000 members, most of whom were new to Unitarianism. The hope was that fellowships would grow into full-service congregations with professional ministry, continuing the spread of Unitarianism around the country. This goal was only partly fulfilled. Some fellowships, like our congregation here, called ministers, there's our first minister, changed their name to church, which we did in 1960, and remained active congregations on into the present as we are. Some stayed small and remain lay-led today. and others only lasted a few years. But the fellowship movement extended the geographical reach of Unitarianism, and when they worked, lay-led fellowships taught members to be ministers to and for each other. One of the strengths of 20th century Unitarianism and Universalism was, as it is today, religious education programs for children. Many people helped make this so, but chief among them was Sophia Lyon-Fahs. And yes, she did live to be 102. Originally a Presbyterian, she was known for her experimental teaching methods, but she was increasingly dissatisfied with Christianity's answers to life's tough questions. And when her 13-year-old daughter died, Fahs lost her belief in an all-powerful, all-loving God. So she was receptive when in 1937, Frederick May Elliott asked her to come to the American Unitarian Association to revise and expand its curricula. To say what Fahs did was revise and expand, however, is an understatement. She revolutionized religious education. Her new Beacon series began not with the Bible, but with children's own questions and their own experiences of mystery and wonder. She used stories from many religions and cultures and from science to help kids explore the sacred within themselves and in other people. She wanted each child to make his or her own spiritual journey and to be loved and supported along the way. Her approach was radical for its time, and her ideas continue to influence today's teachers. She would love the way children are welcomed and included here in this congregation. Angus Hector McLean was also raised Presbyterian, but found that his liberal views fit better with Universalism. Trained for ministry, he decided that his real calling was as a religious educator. In 1928, he came to the Universalist Theological School at St. Lawrence University, where he served for many years as a professor of religious education and later as a dean. But like that of Sophia Fahs, McLean's approach to religious education was child-centered and experiential, not Bible-based. He said, the method is the message, meaning that how religion is taught is as important as what is taught. He had a lasting influence on religious education, and each year at our UUA General Assembly, the Angus McLean Award is presented for excellence in this field. In this slide, it's being presented to the Liberal Religious Educators Association, of which Tina is part. But McLean challenged all of us, whether we're educators or not. We have, he said, abandoned old ideas of God, but what will replace them? He discovered more questions than answers in his own journey, but you may resonate with his ideas that the holy is rooted in the creative processes of nature, and that an indwelling spirit of life connects all that is. It's appropriate that Sophia Fahs and Angus McLean lead us into our next topic, because youth pioneered the merger that led to bringing Unitarians and Universalists together. The adults of the two denominations did not agree to get together until 1961, but the American Unitarian Youth and the Unitarian Youth Fellowship combined forces to become Liberal Religious Youth, LRY, 8 years earlier in 1953. Hymn number 318 in our gray hymnal was actually written to celebrate the creation of the LRY in 1953. I was raised Unitarian, and I remember singing the original lyrics to this hymn, which began, "We would be one as now we join in singing our hymn of youth to pledge ourselves." Tentative steps toward the merger of the youth groups had actually begun back in the 1890s when, against the advice of their elders, some things don't change much, Universalist youth invited their Unitarian counterparts to schedule their conventions at the same time so that they could have some joint activities. The youth began working together on social justice in the 1930s and started to negotiate merger, but discussions were on again, off again, and adults were still opposed. Youth, however, continued to see merger as the key to expanding our movement, and finally, the adults also became convinced. In 1982, LRY reorganized and changed its name to Young Religious Unitarian Universalists, YRUU. Across the continent, UU youth groups strive to be places where everyone is welcome and included, where each person's ideas and gifts are respected, and where young people can find a safe space to learn about leadership and commitment to the ideals of justice, integrity, and compassion. And springing from our concern for youth are our path-breaking sexuality education programs, About Your Sexuality, and its successor, our current program, Our Whole Lives. Hymn number 145 in our hymnal was written in 1933 to celebrate the growing closeness, which I think they thought would get closer faster than it did, of the Universalist Church of America and the American Unitarian Association. The original words begin, "As tranquil streams that meet and merge and flow as one to seek the sea, our kindred fellowships unite to build a church that shall be free." This text expresses who we have become, I think, but the initial merging of our kindred fellowships was not all that tranquil. The idea of forming a larger denomination from the AUA and the UCA had been around for more than a century, as we may remember from last time when we encountered several Unitarians and Universalists who thought the two should be one. Serious discussion of merger, however, did begin in the 1930s, but then World War II intervened. But in the late 1940s, Frederick May Elliott began to speak to Universalists and Unitarians around the country about merging. A poll taken at that time of churches found resistance, especially among Universalists, who were a smaller group and feared losing their identity. Besides, complained one Universalist, Unitarians are more interested in analyzing the nature of infinity than experiencing the spirit of love. It had been agreed that in order to proceed with merger discussions, at least 75% of the churches in each of the two denominations would have to agree to do so. When only 72% of Universalist congregations agreed, the steering committee simply lowered the requirement to 60% and the process went ahead. But progress was slow. In 1953, a Council of Liberal Churches was formed to cooperate, Unitarians and Universalists together, in areas of religious education, public relations, and publications. It worked well, actually, for the creation of religious education curricula, but the joint PR and publications programs never got off the ground. It seemed that full merger into a single denomination was going to be a better idea. But some Unitarians felt Universalists were too conservative and would slow growth. Universalists thought they would just get swallowed up. So we applied our usual solution, a committee. In 1955, a joint merger commission was formed with 6 members from each denomination, and they studied the feasibility of merger. They prepared a 103-page information manual and study guide, which went to all congregations. A 1959 plebiscite found the grassroots sentiment in both denominations now strongly supported consolidation. So that October, delegates assembled in Syracuse, New York, to consider a constitution and bylaws for a merged Unitarian Universalist denomination. On the first day, delegates came together in a joint session that lasted till 1 a.m. They were partly debating organizational issues, but the thorniest issue was theological identity. The proposed constitution was to contain a set of purposes and principles, an earlier incarnation of our present statement. But how Christian should these purposes and principles be? Could we acknowledge our Christian heritage and at the same time affirm, as one delegate put it, that religion is a bigger word than Christianity? The Merger Commission had suggested that our purpose, up at the top here, was to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorially summarized in their essence as love to God and love to man. Revisions were proposed, adding references to truths taught by Jesus and the great prophets, and summarized in our Judeo-Christian heritage. Opinion was sharply divided over these issues, with many Universalists arguing to include these revisions. Tempers flared, and it seemed like the whole merger idea was going to fail. Eventually, however, the desire to find common ground prevailed, and a compromise was reached, which you see down at the bottom. The reference to Jesus was dropped, and the other phrase was changed to the Judeo-Christian heritage instead of our Judeo-Christian heritage, which is why a three-letter word may have made all the difference in our history. In Syracuse, the Universalist vote in favor of merger at the end of the meeting was 238 yes, 33 no, and the Unitarian vote in favor was 518 to 43 with 3 abstentions. One more plebiscite. Never let it be said that we don't hold enough votes on things. One more plebiscite was held to make sure the congregations agreed with their delegates. In early 1960, 79% of Universalist churches and 91% of Unitarian voted for merger. Our congregation here in Los Alamos voted yes to merger, though we did not change our name. And that May, delegates met in Boston to make the decision formal. It must have been a bittersweet occasion, filled with grief at the ending of each group's separate identity, but also with excitement about their future together. After more than a century of on and off deliberating, Unitarians and Universalists were one. More than 2,000 people gathered in Boston for a celebration. The pulpits from which the 19th century greats Hosea Ballou, Universalist, and William Ellery Channing, Unitarian, had preached were brought in for the occasion. Dana McLean Greeley and Philip Randall Giles, heads of the Unitarians and Universalists, together lit a large candle from 2 smaller ones to symbolize our union. It would be another year before all the legalities were completed and the Unitarian Universalist Association became an official entity, which is why we say 1961 was really the date of our merger. But really, that May 1960 worship service marks the UUA's beginning, as those present spoke these words. And I invite you to read them aloud along with me and see if we can imagine ourselves at this historic occasion. We, Unitarians and Universalists, children of the Judeo-Christian heritage, inheritors of the wisdom of the universal prophets, eager to experience the insights of the great faiths of the world, open to all sources of inspiration, ancient and modern, determined to explore the boundless ocean of truth which lies about on every hand, and welcoming into fellowship all of whatever background or faith, here together on this night of consolidation, conscious of the presence of the past and of our urgent tasks, dedicate ourselves anew to the free and universal fellowship of all mankind, that is the church to be. Merger brought Unitarian Universalism into being. But rather than rest on our laurels, I want to switch gears now and look at our checkered history with some social justice issues in the 20th century, and especially race, on which I think it is important to spend a fair bit of our time. As the slides I've shown in our 2 sessions so far indicate, we have been a mostly white denomination. That is something that we have often tried to change, and our struggles with racism in ourselves and in our society are ongoing. But there have been some important African Americans in our history, and I would like to tell you about some of them. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to contemporary African American minister Mark Morrison Reed for researching and publishing materials about these pioneers. The first was Universalist Joseph Jordan, I don't have a picture of him, who converted himself through reading books by Universalist theologians. He started a Black congregation in Norfolk, Virginia in 1887 and was ordained 2 years later. Believing education was the route to equality, Jordan organized a school open to all Black children, and this is a picture of his school in Norfolk. He persuaded the Universalist General Assembly to fund a small building for worship on Sundays and school during the week. The church was relatively successful, the school phenomenally so. Jordan's assistant, Thomas Wise, the second Black Universalist minister, founded another church and school in nearby Suffolk, Virginia. Jordan died, and eventually Wise left Universalism, but their work was continued by Joseph Fletcher Jordan, no relation to that first Joseph Jordan. Joseph F. Jordan attended theological school at St. Lawrence University and was ordained Universalist in 1904. He rapidly built up the church and school in Suffolk that Wise had started. Some parents disagreed with his Universalist ideas, but they nevertheless sent their children to his school, which was widely acknowledged to be far superior to any other educational opportunities for Black kids in the area. After J.F. Jordan's death in 1929, the church closed and the school was taken over by his daughter, Annie Willis. In the late 30s, it became a neighborhood center offering social services and early childhood education, and later on pioneering the first Head Start program in the region. Denominational support from the Universalists continued until 1969, but by the time of Annie Willis's death in 1977, most Jordan neighborhood house activities had been taken over by other agencies and its Universalist roots largely forgotten. After the Civil War, Fannie Barrier Williams left her home in Brockport, New York, and went south to teach freed slaves. There she discovered that, as she put it, to be a colored woman is to be discredited, mistrusted, and often meanly hated. My faith in justice, love, and many sacredly taught sentiments has greatly decreased since I have learned how little even these stand for when you're a colored woman. She went to Chicago, where she became an active member of All Souls Unitarian Church. A dynamic lecturer, she was one of the few women invited to speak at the World's Parliament of Religion in 1893, where she criticized Christianity pretty harshly for being a tool of slavery and racial prejudice. And her Unitarian sentiments come through in her speech when she calls for more religion and less church, less theology and more human brotherhood, less speechifying and more love for truth. For her, the heart of religion was action, and she was one of the first to identify segregated housing and discrimination in employment as two critical areas in which the battle for racial justice must be waged. She also believed that equal opportunity in education was crucial and worked tirelessly for good jobs for Black women. She never entered ministry, though she would have been great, but she directed an interracial settlement house and training center, helped found an integrated hospital and nurse training school, and was the first woman and the first Black to serve on the Chicago Library Board. She worked for women's rights to vote, fighting, not, unfortunately, always successfully, to ensure that Black women would not be left behind in the struggle for women's rights. Born in Jamaica, Egbert Ethelred Brown was working as an accountant when he chanced upon William Ellery Channing's sermon, Unitarian Christianity, which we talked about last time, and found that the views therein fit his own ideas. Drawn to ministry, he attended Meadville Theological School. He was told there that there was no call for African-American Unitarian ministers in the US. So he went back to Jamaica after he graduated in 1912 and founded a Unitarian church there. The congregation remained small, and there was little denominational support for his efforts. So in 1920, Brown came back to this country, went to New York, and started a Unitarian church in Harlem. Again, denominational officials were not helpful, but Brown was committed to his liberal faith and sure that it could gain a foothold among African Americans. He built up a congregation of about 85 people, but finances were always a problem, and while Brown did annoy some Unitarians by asking for money a lot, race was a significant factor in the lack of support he received. But when Frederick May Elliott became president of the American Unitarian Association, the policy shifted a bit. Elliott wanted to keep that Harlem church going, and he actually hoped that a younger Black minister would take over from the aging Brown and revive the ministry. Brown, however, dug in his heels and had absolutely no intention of retiring. But for Ethelred Brown, God was spirit and Jesus a moral exemplar. He believed the church should be an agent of social change, and his best attended services were open forums on political and social issues. Although he was often treated badly by white Unitarians, he never lost his devotion to his chosen faith. Another early African-American minister, Lewis McGee, began his career as an African Methodist Episcopal preacher. Like Ethelred Brown, McGee discovered Unitarianism by chance. He was supplementing his income by delivering mail, and he came across a copy of the Christian Register, which was the name of the Unitarian magazine back in that day. He read the articles and attended a service where he liked what he called its dignity. Some would call it reserve, but McGee had been uncomfortable with the appeals he was expected to make to his parishioners' emotions. In the late 20s, he went to Chicago, where he met up with an influential group of humanists, including many Unitarians. He asked about entering the Unitarian ministry, but was told he'd have to bring his own church with him, because even among liberal humanists, it was still out of the question for a Black to minister to a white church. After a stint as an Army chaplain in World War II, McGee returned and entered Meadville Theological School. While still a student, he started the Free Religious Fellowship on Chicago's South Side, and after he graduated, he became that fellowship's first minister. He did get help from the American Unitarian Association, which was at long last interested in ministry to the Black community and in becoming more involved in civil rights. In keeping with McGee's humanist views, the fellowship's worship was very simple, with no rituals. Most of its members were African American, and McGee was convinced that Unitarianism was not just for white folk. To him, freedom of mind and heart, a continuing search for truth, ethical living, and the creative power of love are values that know no bounds of race. Jeffrey Campbell graduated from the theological school at St. Lawrence University in 1935 and was ordained into the Universalist ministry. The Universalist state superintendent had opposed Campbell's ordination and his admission to St. Lawrence on the grounds that it was a waste of money to educate a black man. So our history is not always all that great. 3 years later, Campbell became a Unitarian minister, but he had trouble finding a position in either denomination. He did serve a few assistant pastorates and a part-time ministry, and he ran unsuccessfully for governor of Massachusetts on the socialist ticket. But he spent most of his career teaching at the Putney School, which is a private school in Vermont. When Campbell's sister, Marguerite, married a white seminarian, Francis Davis, their interracial marriage was attacked in the denominational paper, The Universalist Leader. Nevertheless, Marguerite did end up working for the Universalist Church. Francis never got a ministerial placement and worked for the Urban League instead, so not a happy story. David Eaton fared better. Originally a Methodist, he was the first African American to serve as a minister in a large Unitarian Universalist church. During his tenure, All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. became a center of community service and social action and was the first congregation within the UUA to achieve a racially balanced black and white membership. Times had changed at least a little bit since Campbell's day, and UUA President Dana Greeley had encouraged Eaton to apply at All Souls. Eaton's powerful preaching and outspoken social justice work attracted black and white members, and the congregation struggled to develop a church where relationships could transcend skin color. Eaton worked hard, but he recognized that he and his congregation sometimes fell short. "We know what life is and what life ought to be," he said. "Many of us are dislocated between the is and the ought. But may we continue to care." In the mid-1960s, many UUs joined Martin Luther King's efforts to end racial discrimination. Some marched in Selma in 1965, and as you probably know, 2 UUs, Viola Liuzzo and the Reverend James Reeb, were killed there by white supremacists. The Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts were passed, but then King was murdered, Black power exploded on the scene, and riots rocked many cities. How should UUs respond? In 1967, the Black UU Caucus was formed. And at the request of the caucus, the 1968 UUA General Assembly established a Black Affairs Council to be funded for 4 years at $250,000 per year. The money was for political, economic, and educational projects in the wider Black community, not usually based in UU churches. Projects to promote Black empowerment and self-determination. Some saw the caucus and the council as ways for UUs to put their money where their mouths were. Others saw them as Black separatist groups and disliked their in-your-face tactics. So the 1968 General Assembly also funded another group, Black and White Alternative, later called Black and White Action, which was given $50,000 for scholarships for Black ministers, race relations seminars, Black history curricula, and urging churches to use investments and buying power to support racial equality. Many white UUs and some Blacks found Black and White Action's integration-focused actions more comfortable than the Black Power approach of the Black Affairs Council. So, at the 1969 General Assembly, the Black Affairs Council did get another year of funding, but by a very close vote, and only after acrimonious debate and parliamentary maneuvering, which included a walkout by council supporters. Black and White Action got no funding. Accusations of racism were made, and everybody left angry. The following year, in 1970, the UUA reduced the funding for the Black Affairs Council Black Affairs Council decided to disaffiliate themselves, and the General Assembly voted to defund them. Was the UUA getting cold feet about Black empowerment? It kind of looks that way, but it's also true that financial problems at that time meant that the UUA had to cut its entire budget by 40%. So the UUA board ended up focusing more on survival than on the divisive and frustrating work of confronting racism. Other funding sources were available to the Black Affairs Council, and African Americans needed to lead the struggle for self-determination, but disaffected people on both sides of this controversy ended up leaving the denomination. During the 1970s, internal divisions weakened all of the agencies whose acronyms I had up on the board earlier. And our once bold, they just kind of faded away, and our once bold attempt to confront racism ended in kind of a whimper. This book, Empowerment, tells in greater detail the story of the whole sad time. It was nearly 20 years before the UUA once again began to seriously grapple with the quest for racial justice. In 1992, the General Assembly voted unanimously, that hardly ever happens, to affirm a vision of a racially diverse and multicultural Unitarian Universalism, and to implement a process to realize that vision. These could have just been words. But, as the Reverend Victor Carpenter put it, we have been provided with that rarest of human opportunities, a second chance. 25 years ago, we had the opportunity to lead this country's religious community in the direction of racial justice. We rose up and we fell back. The vision was too blurred, the rhetoric too harsh, the pain too deep. Now we are again given a chance. We are called to do justice, to love mercy, and to work humbly for the empowerment of our brothers and sisters. Let's not blow it. The UUA then embarked on a program to train ministers and lay leaders on issues of systemic racism, to diversify UUA staff and trustees, to bring more people of color into our ministry, and to plan programs to involve congregations in racial justice work. For 5 years, each General Assembly focused on race. Sometimes our efforts were joyful, sometimes painful. Lessons were learned, programs revised. This work culminated in a 1997 vote to become an anti-racist multicultural association. Journey Toward Wholeness was envisioned as an ongoing anti-racism program to support this goal. And in 2001, we elected the first Black president of the UUA, Bill Sinkford, who actually, as a youth, had walked out of that 1969 General Assembly during the Black empowerment controversy and left Unitarian Universalism for a while. Luckily for us, he decided to come back. But of course, the work of racial justice was not and is not finished. After the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement a few years ago, it's become clear that there is much more work to do in our society as a whole and within our own congregations as well. Black Wives of Unitarian Universalism was formed in 2015 to provide support, information, and resources for Black Unitarian Universalists, and to expand the role and visibility of Black UUs within our faith. In October of 2016, the UUA board voted to allocate $300,000 to Black Lives of UU for immediate organizing needs and $5 million in long-term financial support. As with racial justice, religious institutions have been slow to act for equal rights for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. UUs have not been immune to this prejudice. And you would be horrified to read some of the homophobic letters to the editor of the UU World that appeared back in the 1970s. However, nevertheless, we took a leading role among faith communities in this area. Our first openly gay minister was James Stoll, who came out in 1969. Thanks to his leadership, the 1970 General Assembly resolved to end discrimination against gays, lesbians, and bisexuals in the UUA. And in the years since that vote, much has been accomplished. In 1973, an Office of Gay Affairs was established. Now it's called LGBTQ Ministries. In 1984, the General Assembly affirmed the already widespread practice of conducting services of union for same-sex couples. And in 1996, we voted to push for full legal marriage of same-gender couples, the first denomination to do so. Of course, passing resolutions does not automatically make us inclusive. And in 1989, the Welcoming Congregation Program was begun for congregations wishing to become more fully affirming of all sexual orientations and gender identities. Through workshops, religious education, worship, and social action, the program aims to increase understanding, acceptance, and commitment to change. Our congregation here became an official welcoming congregation in 2000. UUs around the country fought for equality at the state and federal levels and celebrated the Supreme Court's marriage equality decision in 2015. Despite the success of the handful of early Universalist and Unitarian women ministers that we met in our last session, by the turn of the 20th century, women had mostly been shut out of our ministry and out of denominational leadership. There were a few exceptions, like the Reverend Florence Buck in the teens and the Reverend Edna Bruner in the 40s, but even they spent most of their careers doing religious education. The 1963 publication of The Feminist Mystique signaled the start of the women's movement in the wider society. And in 1964, the UUA General Assembly finally called for recruitment of ministers without regard to gender for equal pay and financial assistance. Throughout the 1970s, more resolution called for equal employment opportunity in the denomination, elimination of sexist language and assumptions, and the establishment of a Women in Religion Committee. Research into UU women's history blossomed, and women's spirituality conferences and curricula were developed. Moving from resolutions to actuality took a while. In 1974, of the 750 clergy in the UUA, 40 were women, but only 5 of those were actually serving as parish ministers. By the mid-1980s, women were in our ministry and in UUA administration in significant numbers. Among them, our first African-American woman minister, Yvonne Sion. Hymns had been made more inclusive, as they are in our current hymnals, and so had the language in our purposes and principles, which we'll talk about in just a minute. About half of our ministers today are women. And like the Iowa Sisterhood had done 100 years before, they brought us more inclusive worship, shared leadership, small group ministry. In 2017, in just a few months, we will elect the first woman president of the UUA because all 3 candidates are women. In recent decades, we have passed many resolutions to protect the environment, to support work on climate change issues, and to act in other ways to live our 7th principle, respect for the interdependent web. The Green Sanctuary program provides a path for reflection and action. Congregations examine their own environmental impact and work on 4 focus areas: environmental justice, sustainable living practices, religious education, and worship. Completion of the program results in Green Sanctuary accreditation, a formal recognition of a congregation's commitment to the planet. At our 1961 merger, we adopted this set of purposes and principles, which will look sort of familiar, but not quite. During the 1970s, the issues of sexist language in these principles was raised. Many also noted that traditions other than the Judeo-Christian are part of our heritage, that God leaves many out, and that our relationship to the environment is missing. So we revised the statement after a series of failed attempts. We finally had a successful one when someone figured out that it would be a really good idea to divide the statement into 2 parts. 7 principles by which we strive to live, and 5 sources of our living tradition. This is what it ended up with. In 1984, the General Assembly adopted this new statement overwhelmingly, and it became official after a required second vote in 1985. But you may notice that something is missing. In 1995, we added a 6th source, honoring earth-centered religions as part of our heritage and inspiration. And it was a controversial addition. In General Assembly debates, some argued that earth-centered spirituality was a New Age fad with no connection to our tradition. But, as you know if you were here for our last session, we are heirs of the 19th century Unitarian Transcendentalists, for whom nature was a sacred text, with divinity immanent in nature and in ourselves. And here are our 7 principles in kid-friendly language. I wish we had time to talk about Unitarian Universalism around the world. Maybe we could do that another time. But I do want to check in on Transylvania before we close, which you may recall from last time. It's an ethnically Hungarian area of what's now Romania. And you'll remember that they have played an important role in our history. In the late 1500s, there were 500 Unitarian churches in Transylvania. About 120 remain, the oldest Unitarian churches in the world. Their symbol tells us how they have managed to survive centuries of persecution. Be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Through the UU Partner Church program, many Transylvanian congregations are paired with a US or Canadian church that offers ongoing support and connection. And as you know, we are partnered with the church in Fenyukud. Transylvanian Unitarians have bishops, which is something that we don't have. And I met one of the bishops when he visited Virginia back in the 1980s. I was surprised when he began his sermon, "Brothers and sisters in Christ." But although his beliefs were more Unitarian Christian than ours, we share many, many basic convictions, including the oneness of life, freedom of conscience, service to humanity, and affirmation of diversity. And the fact that Transylvanian Unitarians live mostly in poor rural farming areas should remind us that Unitarian Universalism is not just for well-educated urbanites. As John said last Sunday, the minister of our partner church will be visiting us this coming fall, and that will be a wonderful chance to learn much more. Joyce, are you still going to do a forum on Transylvania at some point? Maybe? So there'll probably be a forum too. That will be another way that we can learn more before our guest gets here. UU churches, oh, there's God is one, Egy az Isten, the slogan. UU churches also have partner churches in other parts of Eastern Europe, in Africa, India, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. Most Unitarian Universalist congregations begin their worship with the lighting of the chalice, So that's where we'll end tonight. The symbol goes back to World War II, when the Unitarian Service Committee was sending relief supplies to Eastern Europe and helping refugees to escape. They needed a logo for documents and relief shipments, something that they thought might look official to the governments that they needed to deal with. Hans Deutsch, an artist who had angered the Nazis with his unflattering cartoons, had fled Austria and found work with the Service Committee. So he was asked to come up with a symbol. This was the result, the flaming chalice. And Deutsch said that in his mind, the chalice part symbolizes sustenance and sharing, while the flame represents witness, sacrifice, and courage. The Unitarian Universalist Association began using the logo on documents around 1975, actually looking about like that, and there have been many versions since, and this is our latest logo. Sometime in the 1980s, a chalice was lit to begin worship service at General Assembly and was also being lit during worship in local congregations. But how did a logo become a three-dimensional liturgical object? No one actually knows for sure. But the idea of lighting a chalice probably began in religious education classes and then moved into adult worship. So once again, the youth are in the vanguard here. The flaming chalice can mean many things, but most often it represents the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment. Well, that seems like a good place to end and see if, and welcome whatever questions you might have. You think of any questions that they would like to ask? Yeah, Mary?
I don't know if you noticed or not, when you're talking about the Humanist Manifesto,
Mm-hmm.
and there were several Unitarian ministers and a Universalist minister,
Mm-hmm.
but that was part of a larger.
Yeah,
Is that right?
it was, but there were actually, I think, only 33 or 34 signers. Mary's asking about the Humanist Manifesto, if you couldn't hear her question. And there were, I think, I can't remember exactly, it's either 33 or 34 signers, and most of them were Unitarians. They weren't all ministers, some of them were academics. And there was one Universalist minister, Clinton Lee Scott, who also signed. And I'm sure that there were also some people who weren't Unitarians or Universalists, but the vast majority were. Anybody else that think of any questions? Really? Susan thought of a question. Wait.
I just wanted to know, I should know this better myself, and I think Anne was clear about this, but what is the relationship with ICE, the International Council of Unitarian Universalists?
Susan's asking about the International Council of Unitarian Universalists, and actually I don't know as much as I should about that. I wish Galen were here because he's been very active in that organization and would be able to tell us. And if we do a session on UUism around the world, I would love for that to be a part of it, because I don't even know the founding date of it. Maybe you do. There's also something called the International Association for Religious Freedom, which the UUA is a part of, but that isn't restricted to just UUs. It's many liberal branches of many different world religions. And Wade has been to one of their meetings some years ago. So we are part of a larger world, even though it might not have seemed so from what I was saying tonight, which is mostly about the US. But we've had Unitarian and Universalist movements in Japan, in India, in Europe, in Africa. So there would be, there are lots more, that it's not just It's not just us here, but I'm sorry, Susan, I don't know the answer.
1995 is when it started, but it seems like there's been a lot of hangouts that I don't know about.
Yeah, I don't know them even exactly which countries are members of that group. Yeah, it's a lot, but I don't, yeah, I should look that, I should look that up and know. Wade, did you have a question?
Oh, maybe you could comment on are there any continuing differences between historically Unitarian and historically Universalist churches? I remember one Universalist minister said when we merged, they took the duty for Universalist and the Unitarian from Unitarian and outlaw them all Unitarian. But it's just the way we were feeling about it, and so anyway, we'll never call ourselves Unitarian, we're Unitarian Universalists. But anyway, what do you think about the ongoing differences from the churches that started off Unitarian?
Well, I can turn that back on all of you because, you know, you're all Unitarian Universalists now and often may have experience with other Unitarian Universalist congregations around the country, because I think it varies greatly. Wade and I served a historically Universalist church, but I don't theologically, I don't see much difference between the folks who are in our congregation in upstate New York and the folks who are here in this congregation. There's sure is a different looking building because it's got stained glass windows of Jesus and the Bible, you know, which you don't find here, but there are Unitarian churches that have that too, because, you know, we were, you know, we began as a left wing of Christianity. So it might depend, I wonder if it depends more on the age of the congregation than whether it was Unitarian or Universalist historically. You know, the churches that started during the fellowship movement that we were talking about in the 50s be a lot different than our churches in New England that were, you know, going in the 1700s. I know that doesn't really answer your question because I'm not sure there is an answer. I'm wondering if it might have to do with, you know, length of history almost more than whether it was Unitarian or Universalist at one time. I do know that the Universalists in our New York congregation, and there were a few of them who had been Universalist before merger, were very, very concerned to make sure that their name was not forgotten. You know, that and on that church, which had originally been called the First Universalist Society, changed its name to Unitarian Universalist Church. And you know, so, Dale, you?
Just a small point of history. The first minister of this church was
A Universalist.
Universalist,
Right.
but he didn't push the difference.
Right. Sue?
Do you have much information about Unitarianism in the South? Wally and I were cutting cross country from one small town to the other, and you know, those signs that they have beside the road for mystery.
Yeah.
And just as we went by, I said, you know, one of the original Unitarian churches.
No, universal.
Oh, it was a Universal?
It was
No,
Universal.
okay. But anyway, it was.
It's now a UU, but it was huge.
It was a huge.
And for the size of the area, it must be about the biggest church.
Wow, that's great.
So it just, we never thought of, sort of, we've always thought of it more as a New England kind of.
Yeah, it started there, but certainly didn't stay there. There was a 19th century circuit rider named Crillon Shin, he was Universalist. He started a whole bunch of little churches in the South and in what was then the West, you know, i.e. Pennsylvania, you know, or, you know, New York, Western New York State, but, you know, and he had I think some of his are still there too, you know, that may have been part of the beginning. He was so committed to doing that. And, you know, as we saw even tonight, the earliest African-American ministers were Universalists and they were in Virginia. And I think the fellowship movement also got some churches, some Unitarian churches started in the South as well as, and certainly that was the goal. it was to move south and west and not just be, you know, a New England religion. But it would be neat to learn more about the history of some of those congregations. But I have other thoughts. Okay, well, in the shameless self-promotion department, I invite you to join us on the 26th for a little bit more UU history. The service will be about the life and music of Unitarian composer Bela Bartok. We'll have some special music, and we'll be talking about his life. I'm going to give the sermon, and I'm going to talk a little bit about his music, but mostly I want to talk about his religious ideas and sort of how he came to become a Unitarian. He wasn't a Unitarian Universalist because we didn't have that yet, but his religious ideas. So it's not going to be a music appreciation lecture, but there will be some wonderful music. So we hope that you will be able to join us. And now we invite you to adjourn to the fellowship hall where Tina has some snacks, and we can chat some more there. Thank you all so much for coming.
Stop.